Welcome to Compound Insights, a podcast by CFA Society New York. I'm your host, Rob Rowan. Today we're welcoming back Mirtha Kastrapeli, who is an MD and Global Head of Natural Capital at ISS ESG. Previously, she was a Senior Fellow at Columbia Center on Sustainable Investments and was in different research roles at State Street. She has a BA from Ave Maria College in San Marcos, Nicaragua, and an MBA from Brandeis. So welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Today we're talking about something I think is fascinating. It's sort of the new realm in ESG investing, and that is on biodiversity. And this is exceptionally important. It's been framed by several multinational organizations at events this fall. So you all have done some exceptionally interesting work that will help people who are doing due diligence on this new basis. So could you start with your broad thoughts on what's important to consider when looking at biodiversity and ESG investing?
Yes. Biodiversity is one of the areas, and it has been the area that has been more getting more attention on the broader topic of nature. In our work, we have obviously done extensive work in the topic of biodiversity, but what we found to make it a little more tangible for our institutional investors' clients is to really focus on something that I call the low-hanging fruit in regards to nature. And that topic is deforestation. If we think about biodiversity loss, it's driven by 5 what is called impact drivers. By large, the most significant impact driver for biodiversity loss is land use change. And when you look at land use change, it's specifically deforestation and in the agricultural sector that is driving the bulk of this land use change. So if we wanted, again, focus on kind of the low-hanging fruit, high-impact activities, deforestation is a great way to start when we think about taking action and considering nature-related topics, including the biodiversity, in the investment process.
Great. I think this is exceptionally important in many places, right? It's around the world. These are issues that investors are facing. So let's take a step down from there. How do you all approach this from an investments perspective?
So from the investment standpoint, we have found that a lot of investors really want to understand the topic of nature. So because of that, and because we've seen our clients trying to unpack this topic, think about what type of data is available, and I'll talk about data today. What are the risks that are directly related with their portfolios? We created our Natural Capital Research Institute earlier in the year to really accompany our clients in understanding and advancing the understanding of nature in the investment decision-making process. Our first report, which I would love to talk about today, is really, again, on the topic of deforestation, which we're publishing this month. And this came really on the back, like I said, of our clients really wanted to understand more. If I can give you a stat, for instance, in our survey last year, our 2023 ISS ESG survey, we found that almost a third of institutional investors said that they believe that deforestation is important or very important in the decision-making process for sectors like the consumer sector, electric, mining, and utilities. So it's very sector-specific, but it's clearly an important topic for our clients.
And those are huge sectors too, right?
Yes.
They are a substantial portion of almost every institutional investor's asset allocation. So,
and I would add, if I may, also a big motivation of this conversation, biodiversity, nature, deforestation, it's the increasing understanding of how topics like climate, which is at the top of mind for a lot of our clients, it's interconnected and indivisible, if you will, with nature. Not only for climate change mitigation to reduce the emissions that are caused by these sectors, but also when we think about climate change adaptation and the opportunities around nature-based solutions. So because of that interest, there is also a big driver for a lot of the work that we do.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned talking to clients about this. How do you help them to focus their thinking around nature as a whole, and how do you take them to the deforestation topic from there?
So this has been over the past few years, and with the really started, again, with the climate conversation has been a big, I would say, catalyst to bring this on. There is the Global Biodiversity Framework that was launched 2 years ago. during COP15 in Montreal. So we're getting these questions where there is interest from the clients. Now, the bigger question, and the question that we're trying to answer in our study, is what is the data? This all sounds good and great. And again, I get it. This is important. What does that mean for my portfolio? Do we have the data available today to start helping incorporate that in our decision-making process, in our analysis? And the answer is yes, there is data. It is not perfect data. And I guess newsflash, there is no perfect data
there's no
around
perfect
nature.
Data, period, right?
But there is data, and we expect this data to continue to improve because we're seeing increasing disclosures, and I can talk about that, but also different models, technological advances that it really support even asset-level data that is really going to help investors really consider these topics in a more rigorous way. But we have enough data today to start the conversation, and that's what we want to focus on.
Okay. So as you know, we're talking to a group of CFA charter holders with 15 years of experience in the business. So all of them are wondering right now, what are the problems with the data? Now, we have a volume of data that we need, but what are the problems with it? What should they be looking out for when they're advising their clients?
Yes. So the challenge with the data is that disclosures of companies is not as extensive as we would like, or is not granular as we would like. So there is TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, that was launched a few years ago. We now have over 500 early adopters that are committing to start disclosing around nature-related risk and opportunities. And these early adopters will start disclosing as early as next year. This is obviously voluntary disclosure, but is also being adopted or in regulation like the ESRS in Europe and others where they're starting to embrace this TNFD, and also as a guidance for corporates in regards to nature-related information. So the issue for disclosure is not as advanced as we would like, but it's getting better. We have also models, and I can talk about that as well, model data that could be used as proxy information based on, again, scientific models that could help understand impacts of companies on nature, biodiversity specifically, with metrics like the PDF or MSA, the potentially diversified fraction of species or mean species assessments, which are scientific models that could help as a proxy to measure impacts or to estimate impacts, I should say. And also there are also model data, and we have at ISS ESG around ecosystem services, which are how are companies dependent on nature. So those data we have today, that again investors could be using to start guiding those decisions and analysis.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I find fascinating about the work you're doing. You're merging the hard financial data with some hard scientific data that is from many different disciplines, and you're kind of putting it together into a way to verify the data that you do have right now. And I'm not sure there are many other people doing that. That is exceptionally interesting. So I think I maybe interrupted you there. You were going to go on to say something else about the data?
Well, so much to say about the data. I mean, the data, one thing I would say about nature-related data is that there's no one single metric. So this is something for us to consider as we think about climate data, right? We have emissions. Is that one single metric that everybody's looking at? Greenhouse gas emissions. In nature, we are looking at sector-specific data. The impacts in the agricultural sector is going to be very different than in the mining sector, right? Or even the financial sector when you think about exposures to nature-related risk. For instance, if you look at the textile and apparel industry, right? So these are sector-specific. When we think about nature, again, we look at ISS ESG, we're looking at across different pillars, biodiversity being one, and I mentioned PDF and MSA as proxies of model data on the impacts on biodiversity. But we also have water, fresh water usage. intensity of the use of water, dependencies of water. That's another big, huge piece in the nature conversation. We have oceans. We have what we call FLAG, forest, land, and agriculture. And now, again, the forestation piece obviously is connected to that. But there are many aspects to nature. And as you can imagine, there's no one single metric that we will be able to use.
Right. The water one, I also, because of some of the work I did before this podcast, I found the water one also fascinating because of the global volume of it. Um, it means different things in so many different places. How do you reckon the data on water is doing?
Yes, we organize the data, and take a step back, and I referenced this a little bit already, around impact data, dependencies data, and performance data. So one is around how are companies' activities having an impact on a various resources. So I mentioned some model data earlier. Dependencies, that would be another type of data. How are different companies or industries dependent on certain ecosystem services, what we call, or provisioning services? If you think about timber or water, if you're a textile company or a technology company. Right. And we're able to assess those dependencies at the company level, and then and at the industry level, more importantly. And then we have performance data. What are companies doing about it? We recognize that those risks exist, those impact exists, those dependencies exist. Now, as an investor, you want to understand what are companies, again, doing about it? How are they managing their risk? Are they assessing those risks? Are they putting policies in place to mitigate those potential risks or to prepare themselves to build that resilience in the face of a shock in a natural resource or an ecosystem service? So these are what we call the performance data and specific KPIs that we have developed across different sectors. These are sector level, what we call KPIs that we have collected as part of our corporate ratings and data offering.
Okay. When you work with institutional investors on this type of work, do they have the capabilities and even the systems in place to work with this kind of data in this way, or are they leaning mostly on you for that?
We have pretty sophisticated investors that get it. Most of the conversations that we've been having is around a transition risk. So again, I wanted to talk about risk in general, and we organize, again, risk similar to what we do with climate. Physical risk, transition risk, and system level risk. This is using the TNFD framework, which is similar to the TCFD framework, the Task Force for Climate-related Financial Disclosures, which is more widely accepted and known in the investment community. So out of those risks, transition risk in nature is what it seems to be a big driver of a lot of these conversations. So investors understand transition risk. Just to give you an example, when we think about transition risk for deforestation related, since we had this paper on that, and again, are a risk that result from, when a key economic actor, such as a company, is strategically misaligned with actions that are taken by societal groups, like a government, to reduce the negative environmental and social impacts of deforestation, in this case. So this transition risk could be seen as part of a litigation risk, regulatory risk, market risk, technological risk. And this conversation is really driving a lot of, particularly on the regulatory front, is driving a lot of investors to start looking at their portfolios in a more, I would say, rigorous way, deeper way around nature-related risk.
Okay. And do you factor in that headline risk, which is what we used to call it in my own thing? I'll just to give an example of that. So this last week, I listened to a podcast. There was a debate between a former chair of Timberland
Yep.
and somebody else who was talking about how fast fashion, even though it got such a bad reputation for a while, actually didn't go anywhere. And this is, maybe changed less. This is, could become a serious headline risk for apparel companies and other companies that are along that supply chain. So how do you factor that into the risks you just mentioned there?
We absolutely look at that. The thing about nature risk and also a lot of sustainability risk for these large corporates are really in the supply chain. sometimes I say it's like that's where all the skeletons are hidden, is in the supply chain. Right. We do have, like I said, on nature-related issues on the supply chain. And a lot of the data that we have is actually looking at the supply chain. I think that's important characteristics when you look at around nature-related impacts and dependencies. I think that's an area where we need to pay attention. There is, speaking of regulatory risk, in addition to the headline risk that you mentioned, we have the European Union CSDDD, corporate sustainability due diligence disclosure, that is actually is going to be requiring companies of certain size in Europe and also companies that are doing business in Europe to be doing this more stringent due diligence on environmental issues and on social issues. So when you think about labor rights, child labor, modern slavery, and others, very complex situation. We also have, again, going back to nature, the EU deforestation law. Again, coming out in Europe, expected to get into effect at the end of 2025. That is also going to require these corporates to start looking at their supply chain impacts on forests. And are they deforestation free, or they need to be free of these newly deforested areas? And again, something that we go in much detail in our paper. But this is just examples of how specific regulation is now pushing this need for investors to look under the hood in their corporates, particularly around their supply chain, for a lot of these nature-related risk and also social risk, which is, again, another key part both for climate transition and nature transition.
Yeah, to me, this is a very interesting evolution of the regulatory environment, right? Because it not just apply to EU companies. It's to anyone, right? The EU's been doing a lot of this type of regulation lately. I noticed that GDPR, the privacy rules in Europe, now apply to European citizens wherever they are and their spouses. So it's gotten complicated real fast for companies even like CFA New York, because that impacts us in that the company might send me an email and not realize that my wife is an Italian citizen. And I'm covered by GDPR too then. Yeah. So it's going to get complicated very quickly. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention in your papers that you think is particularly interesting? I think we've done a good job of getting people to go over and look at them, but I just want to give you one more chance to.
I think we covered a lot. Again, my main, call to action here is that you need to be looking, like I said, under the hood in a lot of your portfolio companies as an investor, as a professional investor. I want to bust the myth that there's no data on nature. Yes, there is data, good enough data to start at least considering these exposures in the portfolio around nature. I would encourage people to understand and to read in some of the new guidance around, with the TNFD, for instance, and how we should be thinking about nature risk similar to what we do with climate risk around physical transition and system level risk. And hope everybody can read our report, reach out. Would love to have a conversation and looking forward to discussing more in the future.
Yeah, so if you are interested in finding these papers, you can obviously go to ISS Stoxx website, but you can also follow Mirtha on LinkedIn, where she posts them in a very nice, neat order. That's why I found them. So Mirtha, thank you for being here again, and thank you for sharing this with members of CFA Society New York.
Thank you.
And thanks to you all for listening. If these topics are particularly interesting to you, in addition to the paper, I would recommend you check out an event that we have coming up on January 29th. That's the 11th Annual Sustainable Investing Symposium. It is an afternoon of topics around this and has some really interesting speakers, and you can sign up for that on our website at cfany.org. Until next time, I'm Rob Rowan, and this has been Compound Insights.